Welcome to the resource sharing session this afternoon, sponsored by the South Australian Government, so a big thank you to them. I'm Cassie Price, I'll be your session chair for this session through 4 fantastic speakers, and I won't take up any more of Claire's time. I'd like to invite Claire Smallwood from the Department of Primary Industry. She's a research scientist in WA. Please. Let me know if you have any problems with that. Yeah, I will.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining me today to have a chat about exploring traditional and contemporary measures of recreational fishing to inform resource allocation, for which we'll be using the case study of the blue swimmer crab recreational fishery in Western Australia. This is work which is currently underway by, as part of a project completed by myself and a number of colleagues from the surveys team from the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development in Western Australia. So we all know that recreational fishing is a popular activity globally, and this is no more so than in WA, where we have a participation level of 25%. Like many countries, there's an increased diversity in fishing activity, with fishers targeting a variety of species using many fishing methods and platforms. And there's also a higher spatial and temporal variability in the distribution of stocks and resources and their associated management units. And all of these factors combine to increase the challenges that we have for data collection, monitoring and management. So resource sharing between sectors is often a mechanism used to ensure sustainability and equitable access between sectors. Traditionally, resource allocation has been assessed primarily based on quantitative metrics such as input controls, the number of licences, and total catch. There's currently 3 resources in Western Australia which have explicit catch allocations, which is the abalone, lobster and west coast demersal scalefish. However, there are some challenges with these metrics, with sectors and collecting and providing data in different ways, which means quite often we require adjustments to standardised units of measurements. And in addition, especially for the recreational sector, data is often not available annually across all resources. And these approaches, looking at real quantitative metrics, also fail to account for some of the different motivations and social aspects of resource use by the different sectors. We know the recreational fishers are very diverse and have a lot of different motivations. However, and it's been interesting this morning already to hear about the fact that we all need to start considering these social and economic aspects of resource use, and this will soon be a requirement as part of some new fisheries legislation in Western Australia. So I think I just covered all that in the previous slide, but basically indicators of social use such as participation and satisfaction, demographics and fisher behaviour will be things that we can consider as part of this, looking at the social outcomes of resource use. So that brings me to the objective of today's presentation, which is how can we provide data for traditional measures of catch and contemporary measures such as social indicators of recreational fishing at spatial scales relevant to management. So although I'm using the term traditional to describe some of the more established metrics like catch, that doesn't always mean that even these traditional metrics have been provided well or consistently for recreational fisheries, so there's still a knowledge gap there for many resources. However, we can also start now incorporating some of these contemporary measures, and today I'll be focusing on demographics and fisher behaviour. So within that broad resource objective, we're focusing on the specific question, can regular broad-scale phone diary surveys be disaggregated to meet this need for small-scale recreational fisheries? So in Western Australia, we've been conducting recreational surveys for over 40 years, but a number of these surveys have been sort of short-term, one-off projects designed to meet specific research questions, and they have achieved those outcomes. However, they haven't provided sort of the long-term monitoring and data to inform management that we need nowadays. Many of the broad-scale surveys, which are conducted nationally or statewide, are implemented regularly and are planned to be ongoing, which is why we think they should be considered to see if we can develop some efficiencies in providing data, not only for the broader bioregions and zones, which those surveys are designed for, but hopefully they could also inform management of smaller scale fisheries. So just a brief overview of the survey methodology. The detail and the technical information around these surveys have been published in reports and papers. So if anyone is interested in looking them up, they're available online, or you can come and have a chat to me about it after the presentation. But today I'll be looking at data from 5 phone diary surveys, which were conducted for 12-month periods between 2011-12 and 2020-21. In Western Australia, we have a recreational boat fishing licence, with about 130,000 of those issued every year. And that's our sampling frame. And within each of those surveys, we randomly select across a number of residential strata 3,000 licence holders to participate in the survey. Again, the analysis of this data and the disaggregation approaches we are using is something that we've completed previously and published. There's more information available, or come and chat to me if you want the nitty-gritty on that. But we're using a location-based analysis method, and we're assessing the success of our disaggregations based on sample size and the relative standard error. And it was one of Zach Bradford's talk earlier. I'm not sure if anyone heard that, but did touch on some of those issues. So why have we selected blue swimmer crab as an interesting case study to look at this disaggregation? Firstly, the species has a really wide distribution in nearshore waters, which is classified as less than 20 metres of depth in Western Australia, so that's highlighted in the green. So they're distributed throughout Western Australia and beyond. However, the highest abundances of the blue swimmer crabs are in coastal embayments and estuarine areas, particularly around the southwest of Western Australia, between Perth and Augusta. It's one of the biggest recreational fisheries in Western Australia. It's the second highest catch by numbers for boat-based recreational fishers. It's also the first recreational fishery in the world to have been certified under MSC, which was a joint certification between commercial and recreational fisheries in the Pilharvey estuary, which is located again in the southwest corner, in 2016. And finally, it's interesting because it allows us to test our phone diary survey data across a number of spatial areas, because the crab fisheries have very varied spatial scales of their stocks and also management units. So recreational fisheries in WA are predominantly managed at the bioregional scales, which those 4 marine bioregions are shown on the map here. And that's what our phone diary survey is designed to produce estimates at those scales. And there's different management input and output controls for each of those bioregions. However, blue swimmer crabs are a bit of an exception. As I said, they've got very localised stocks. And the 13 commercial fisheries, which is sort of those stocks are divided based on those 13 commercial boundaries, are distributed throughout Western Australia, and they're all shown on the map here. And the reporting of the recreational catches has been aligned with those commercial boundaries. So today, although we do have data statewide, I'll be focusing just on 9 small-scale fisheries located between Shark Bay in the Gascoyne bioregion, and then the real hotspot for blue swimmer crabs between Perth and Augusta. And so many of these fisheries down in the southwest here are located adjacent to the most populated part of WA, especially the capital city of Perth, which has over 2 million people. So moving on to some results. Firstly, we'll have a look at fishing effort. So basically, we have each panel for each of the survey years, so starting at 2011 and 12 and moving across to the most recent survey. We're displaying fishing effort, which is boat days, so that's the number of times people they went fishing on their boats as a day. And then the fisheries, the case study fisheries I'm looking at are ranged from Shark Bay in the north all the way down to the Hardy Inlet on the south. So the other thing I need to just note is that these little asterisks indicated here, of which there are quite a few. Now that indicates we deemed the estimate to be non-robust based on our measures of success of the disaggregation. So there was small sample size and high relative standard error. So after we've got through all that, we can see that there's three main fisheries. We've got the Peel Harvey estuary here, which has the highest fishing effort for crabs across all years, followed by the Swan Canning estuary, which is located in the Perth metropolitan area, and also the Geograph Bay. In terms of the total effort that crab fishing contributes to the whole fishery, we found this was quite interesting. So this is the average across all years, followed by the range. So for three of those fisheries, for which we have robust estimates for the Swan and the Peel Harvey, fishing effort for crabs contributed over half the fishing effort, recreational fishing effort in that fishery. So when we look at the total catch, this is total catch by number, so including kept and release. Again, the figure's got a similar format with the years, survey years across the top and the fisheries arranged from north to south. Unsurprisingly, as this sort of mirrors effort, we have Peel Harvey estuary with the highest numbers of kept and released crabs, followed again by the Swan and Geograph Bay, for which we also had robust estimates. So something we always get asked with recreational survey data is the reasons for release. So obviously that total catch is including kept and released. So within each of those fisheries, we could also look at the number that was released. So for the Mandurah to Bunbury developing fishery, Leschenault Inlet and Geograph Bay, over 65% of those crabs were released. And the main reason for release in all of those cases was that the crabs were undersized. So what we could do then, after we'd done that analysis, we could take the kept catch from the 5 survey years for the recreational sector and we could convert it to weight. And so then we could compare the harvest of the recreational sector against the harvest from the commercial sector. I haven't used values for this, I've just assigned a proportion. So across the bottom, it's the proportion that each sector has taken of crabs in each of those fisheries. So one of the interesting things that you can see is that there's no catch data for Cockburn Sound after 2014, and that's because this fishery was closed to all recreational crab fishing at that point in time. And we can see as we walk down the figure that Shark Bay, Warnbro Sound, Mandurah, Bunbury are predominantly commercial fisheries, and it's quite consistent between years. The Swan estuary and the Peel Harvey, for which we have robust estimates of catch, are relatively mixed sector. It's quite an even distribution between catch taken from the commercial and the recreational sector. The Leschenault and Geograph Bay fisheries, these were commercial fisheries, but they were closed in the early 2000s, so now they're deemed to be recreational only fisheries. And Geograph Bay was one of the fisheries we had robust catch data for. And then the Hardy Inlet, predominantly recreational with some still commercial fishing remaining. So that was sort of a bit of an overview of some of those more traditional metrics, and I think hopefully you can see from those figures that it's useful to have these broad-scale surveys which are providing regular data simultaneously across a number of fisheries. So now we can move on to having a look at some of the more contemporary or social metrics and try and get a handle on who are these people that are fishing for blue swimmer crabs and has this changed over time. So based on those previous results, we just decided to look at the 3 fisheries which had robust estimates of fishing effort and catch, which was the Swan Canning estuary, Peel Harvey estuary and Geograph Bay. So first up, we looked at demographic variables of gender, age and residence. So something we see across many recreational fisheries globally is that for all 3 of these fisheries across all years, the fishing was dominated by males as opposed to females. Again, looking at age, just classified as people who are less than 44 years of age and over 44 years of age, we can see that for nearly all fisheries, it was this older age group who were fishing for crabs. And then one of the more interesting things, and this will be really interesting when we expand our analysis out to cover all of Western Australia because there's really different fishing which occurs across that 13,000 kilometres of coast, but looking at whether fishes are local or non-local. So they were deemed local if they were fishing in a crab fishery which was adjacent to their place of residence. And there was a little bit of variability here. We can see that the Swan Canning Estuary, which is located right within the centre of the Perth metropolitan area, has more local fishes. The Peel Harvey Estuary, which is located 100 kilometres to the south of Perth, has a more even split of local and non-local fishes. And Geograph Bay, which is located 300 kilometres from Perth, again has higher local fishes than non-local. Okay. So fishing behaviour. We looked at the number of fisheries people fished in, mostly fishing in one fishery, and most people were fishing for less than 14 days. So moving on to concluding, my concluding slides. First, what's next? We'll be looking at applying this disaggregation to more resources, and this is especially relevant for fisheries and resources that we know have recreational only, which are recreational only, because the phone diary survey might be the only source of data for these fisheries. There's more social measures that we can look at, which will be part of ongoing research. We also need to test additional hypotheses, do collaboration studies, because it's always good to compare and see if there's other sources of truth for your data and your findings. And we also need to develop a better understanding of out-of-scope fishing, because the recreational boat fishing licence only covers boat fishing and not shore fishing. And the final slide. So I think hopefully what you've found from this presentation, that the disaggregation did improve our knowledge of blue swimmer crab fisheries, especially in the three that we had robust estimates. And over 70% of the statewide catch comes from those fisheries. So that regular data coming in to inform those fisheries will be useful for monitoring, informing and evaluating management settings. We may need to look at alternative sampling regimes for other fisheries where we were getting non-robust catch estimates, such as on-site surveys for small-scale fisheries where that is able to, on-site surveys can be cost-prohibitive. So fishing effort and catch information that I presented can be used to inform harvest strategies and resource allocation, and social and other indicators can help maximise the use of aquatic resources, which may focus more around experiential and health benefits rather than economics. And I'd just like to thank all the fishers who participated, and also the Survey Research Centre at Edith Cowan, who implements these surveys on our behalf. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll chase you away. Welcome, Shane. Shane Walters comes to us from DPI, I want to call it DPI, Department of Fisheries in WA, and is the Principal Fisheries Management Officer there. Let's get your presentation up. Sorry. Back. It's not going to take me off that one. Sorry, everyone. Sorry. My bad. Well, why don't we move on? We know how it works. Getting it to work is different. Don't click there. We're winning.
Cool.
Winning.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. Today I'm talking about 15 years of experience from the department in terms of managing a socially important demersal scalefish resource in Western Australia. So just to, I suppose, learning from what's happened using West Coast demersal scalefish as a case study. So this is this resource covers over 1,000 kilometres of coastline between Skye Barrett and Augusta. It includes over 100 species of demersal scalefish, but predominantly 6 of those species are dominant in the catches and are probably of the main focus. Some of these species are really iconic for recreational and commercial fishes in WA, particularly West Australian dewfish and bulging groper that only occur in these waters in the world. So they're endemic species. This area of water is adjacent to the main population of Western Australia, and so it's really accessible to all recreational, commercial and charter fishers. We have really high participation rates in terms of 40,000 recreational fishers fishing for these species each year, and they're highly vulnerable species to exploitation, so there's significant challenges which I'll go through. Just a bit of early history of the fishery. So in the 90s, early 2000s, there was really limited management and monitoring in place for this resource. We had commercial, open access commercial fisheries with monthly logbooks. We didn't have charter logbooks until 2001. And we also, as Claire mentioned earlier, we only had ad hoc sort of recreational fishing surveys, so limited data in that space in terms of catches. But over time, over those sort of 15 years, we really had increasing catches, pretty similar to a lot of places around the world, increasing concerns from stakeholders, noting these are some iconic species. People were really concerned about the fishing pressure on these species. And in our first stock assessment in 2007, confirmed that this resource was being subject to overfishing and recommended that catches be reduced by at least 50% to recover within a 20-year time frame. So I suppose between 2007 and 2010, we undertook significant reform from all fishing sectors to reduce catches by at least 50%. Noting there was limited management in place prior to these changes and a lack of formal allocation at that time, a lot of those decisions were made in the context of these fisheries, but without a resource sharing framework. So for the recreational sector, including charter, that included managing at the regional scale, so the whole resource, and that the main tool, I suppose, as part of that was to introduce a 2-month effort closure. And there was a range of other supporting tools like bag limits and quite restrictive bag limits and a boat limit for WA dewfish. And for the commercial sector, they had limited entry arrangements brought into place. They were managed by zones across the region. The metro area between Lancelin and Mandurah, so about 250 kilometres, was shut to commercial fishing. And also they were brought into a ITE system, so limited to the number of hours that they could fish in each of the remaining open areas. So some really significant reform, but there were different management approaches applied to the different sectors. Following that process, there was a formal allocation process implemented in 2012, and this really focused on, at a resource level, the catch sharing arrangements between the commercial and recreational sectors, and it was predominantly made based on historical catches, mainly using 2005-06 as a reference point where we had catch estimates for all sectors, but they did take into consideration some benefits to the community through slight adjustments to those percentages, but it was mainly based off catches. There was no thought of, like there is these days, where you're looking at community benefit and those sort of things. But I suppose one of the complexities with this fishery is that was at a resource level, that allocation, but there were also guidelines around some of the key species and those really important species to different sectors. So things like WA dewfish and bulging groper up the top there, they were predominantly recreational species, but still highly valued by the commercial sector, and subsequently for snapper and some of the other species were predominantly commercial dominated species, mainly fished in offshore away from that main population centres, but still really important species for recreational fishers. So in terms of Following the management reform to implement recovery and the catch allocations, there's really a focus over that next decade around managing catches to catch limits. Following the resource allocation, there was improved catch monitoring in place. So as Claire mentioned, we're getting recreational surveys every 2 to 3 years. So we're getting regular catch estimates. And for the commercial and charter sector, they had sort of daily logbooks rather than monthly and certain things. So improvements to how we monitor the catch. What we did see though is, similar to some of the other talks I've listened to, where there's changes in fishing behaviour over time in response to those changes in management, and particularly in the recreational sector where you're seeing really high increases in the release rates of fish, particularly these species that are highly vulnerable to post-release mortality. And there was still a lack of business rules around managing to catch limits and allocations. There was a lack of formal policy in place to support those decision rules, and that led to some sort of ad hoc management, and getting support from decision makers was quite hard. So in 2014-15, there was a catch or capacity reduction for the commercial sector, mainly in response to higher snapper catches. So they haven't exceeded the overall catch, but snapper catches were too high. Whereas on the recreational side, we had increasing catches of all species, but there was still arguments around we're under the total limit, so sustainability-wise it shouldn't be an issue. So having that business framework in place was something that stakeholders were increasingly asking. And the other question was, when we're doing stock assessments every 3 years, is the recovery on track? How do we know where we are along that 20-year journey, and are we on track or not? So in 2021, or 2020, 2021, we developed the harvest strategy, so multi-species, multi-sector resource, and I suppose one of the primary aims was to provide a roadmap to recovery. So answering that question about where should we be at certain points in time, and if we are or we aren't, what management responses are required to ensure we keep recovery on track to recover by 2030. I suppose the other factor was that we, considering the change in fishing behaviour, we also, rather than just monitoring retained catch, we're now considering estimates of post-release mortality on top of catch. So we're monitoring fishing mortality by each sector against the new catch limits. So adjusting those to account for that as well. And I suppose having predefined review processes and agreement on those management responses with involvement from all the sectors in the development of the harvest strategy was critical to get that agreement. So following on about 6 months after the harvest strategy was in place, we got the latest stock assessment for this resource, and what it really shows is that the management was successful in holding the decline in stocks, but there's been really limited recovery, particularly for pink snapper. There's some signs of recovery in different areas, but overall there's been limited recovery. What we did find is, noting we had a lot of the stakeholders as part of the development of the harvest strategy who had a really good knowledge of what we're measuring and how we're measuring things to support the management of the fishery. So we got really good acceptance from key stakeholders on the science, and also the key stakeholders all agreed to the management response in the harvest strategy to reduce the catch limits by a further 50%. So then I suppose the next step is, how do you actually achieve or implement management to achieve that 50% reduction in the overall catch limits? So the government supported the stakeholders' views on reducing the catch limits by 50%, but also went that extra step to allocate that catch limit based on existing allocations for the fishery. So 64% to the commercial sector and 36% to the recreational sector. We undertook extensive consultation involving the key stakeholders and the broader community. So the first step was really around we've got peak sector bodies in WA, so helping the peak sector bodies engage with their stakeholders to develop their preferred management measures that they would like to implement to achieve their 50% reduction. but then also consulting more broadly on applying those preferred management tools to the extent required to meet that 50% reduction. And obviously, when you tell people you need to restrict fishing at all, there's a lot of conflict. And despite having that policy framework, there's still conflict between sectors and within sectors, mostly around best use of the resource in terms of value and those sort of things. So rec versus commercial, but also within the recreational sector, so between recreational fishers and charter fishers, and within the commercial sector. So there's a main dominant line fishery for the commercial fishery. There's also a number of other commercial fisheries that take demersal scale fish as bycatch. So I suppose following on from that management review process, we're in the process of implementing significant management reform based on that consultation process. There are some differences, I suppose, in terms of applying those preferred management measures. With the recreational sector, we're now managing recreational fishers and the charter fishery separate, so they're under different primary control measures. So the recreational fishers are under an effort closure system to restrict their catch, whilst charter are moving towards an explicit catch controls through a tag system so that they can operate 12 months of the year outside of those rec closures. In terms of, I suppose, one of the other learnings from that process was when you're coming down to very restrictive bag limits, some of the challenges are if you go any further, you're going to start eroding amenity and benefits that you get from fishing on the water. So there are some limits in terms of what traditional tools can provide in terms of restricting catch. For the commercial sector, they're under ITE system, so it was really pulling the lever and reducing their available hours to fish. But within the commercial sector, there's also a commercial buyout of licences, and that is predominantly to adjust the catch shares within the commercial sector, so we're not offsetting the need to reduce capacity in some of the commercial fisheries that predominantly target other species, so shark and rock lobster, so that we're not restricting the supply of some of those more sustainable species. So that was one of the offsets. So the line fishery, that is the dominant commercial fishery in this resource, of taking a bit more heavy lifting on behalf of some of the other commercial fisheries that legitimately take some of these species as bycatch as part of their normal fishing operations. Yep. So I suppose one of the other key things around the change in management was about reducing the need for fishers to release fish. So through the surveys that Claire talked about and through other monitoring, we know that 70 to 80% of these fish that are highly susceptible to post-release mortality die because they're being forced to throw them back. So some of the management responses were around reducing the need for people to release those fish, but also complementing that with an extensive education program over a number of years to try to change that fishing behaviour to try and help the recovery of these fish. I suppose there's also additional monitoring coming on, but I suppose just the key takeaways for me as a manager, it's really important that you bring, and we've heard this from a number of talks this morning, it's really important to bring fishers along for the journey, have them involved, and we can still improve in this space, but having them involved in the direct involvement in development of harvest strategies, directly involved in assessing the science against the policy framework, and then also as part of the development of management controls is really important to get some acceptance. You're obviously not going to convince everyone, but also one of the other sort of areas that's a bit of a gap, I suppose, in our policy framework is having a policy framework and mechanisms available that allows us to review sector or resource shares and how you can potentially adjust those in the future to maximise the flow of benefits to the community. So that's an area that we need some work in, but that's some of the key takeaways. So, thank you.
Okay. Now welcoming Skye Barrett. Skye is she's actually the Recreational Fishing Manager, PIRSA. I will just adjust this and try and get this better right than I did before. Hey, now we're onto it. There you are. That should work well for you, Skye, just to move on.
Oh, sorry, guys. Just one on the right, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that will move you forward. But yell out if you need me.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Skye Barrett and I'm the Recreational Fishing Manager at the Department of Primary Industries and Regions in South Australia. I've got a couple of tough acts to follow here. Thanks, Claire and Shane. I do want to start very, very quickly with my presentation just in acknowledging the Bungala people as custodians of the lands and the sea from which I grew up in and where I first learnt my love of the ocean. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation for the lands that we meet on today. So, fisheries management, it presents a number of unique challenges due to several factors. We have the community-owned nature of the resource, we have the competition within the operating environment, a diversity of stakeholders, the biological and ecological dynamics, and the inherent uncertainties that come with the wild aquatic stock. The state government, as the custodians of the state's aquatic resources, are required underneath the Fisheries Management Act to manage fish stocks to ensure that they are sustainable and that they provide access that achieves optimum utilisation and equitable distribution. Snapper is an iconic species in South Australia and it holds a position of great importance to seafood consumers and our fishing sectors. South Australian snapper stocks are uniquely structured in that there are three defined stocks. We've got the Spencer Gulf West Coast stock, the Gulf St Vincent and the South East. The Spencer Gulf and West Coast and the Gulf St Vincent stocks are populations that are defined as their own. However, the South East are predominantly recruited from the Western Victorian stock. There is little to no mixing in between these three stocks of snapper. The South Australian snapper fishery is predominantly accessed by the marine scale fishery, which is a commercial fishery, the South Australian recreational fishery, and to a much lesser extent, the commercial rock lobster fishery. The marine scalefish fishery is a complex, multi-species, multi-gear, multi-region fishery with 205 active licences following the fishery reform. Recent available data estimates the South Australian recreational fishery is comprised of approximately 277,000 fishers that fish for almost 1 million days over a surveyed year, but we'll be receiving some estimates of those numbers on Wednesday. So a snapper management review was undertaken by the Department of Primary Industries and Regions, and a stock assessment report was delivered by the South Australian Research and Development Institute in September 2019. The review and the stock assessment resulted in a depleted classification for the Spencer Gulf West Coast stock, a depleting classification for the Gulf St Vincent, and a sustainable classification for the South East. So following the depleted and the depleting classifications, a closure to snapper fishing was implemented in South Australia in November 2019. Due to the sustainable classifications of the South East stock, the South East fishing zone remained open. So the need to ensure well thought out fisheries management arrangements for the South East, management arrangements for the South East meant that we needed a group and a committee to advise on the best fishing management arrangements and the most appropriate sustainable fisheries management arrangements. So under Section 20 of the Fisheries Management Act, very dry stuff here, but it provides for a committee to be established that can provide advice directly to the state government on any matter that has to do with the administration of the Fisheries Management Act. Importantly, any Section 20 committee needs to have memberships that's comprised of those with their expertise on the matter in which they're providing advice to the state government, and more importantly, must have membership of people who are cognizant of the interests of the relevant stakeholders. So, the Snapper Management Advisory Committee was established under Section 20 of the Act, and it was established with the primary responsibility for providing snapper-specific advice directly to the state government. More importantly, a key responsibility of the Snapper Management Advisory Committee was to guide snapper-specific consultations through direct engagement with the key stakeholders. So this involved an inclusive consultative approach with the commercial marine scalefish, charter boat, recreational, Aboriginal traditional fisheries to reach appropriate and sustainable fisheries management arrangements for the southeast fishing zone. So to ensure an inclusive approach and independently driven approach, more importantly, the Snapper MAC was comprised of an independent chair, sector representatives, independent scientists, independent economists, and PIRSA management and science specialists. So, following consultation, the Snapper Management Advisory Committee provided advice to the Minister to guide the initial allocations for the southeast fishing zone. And this was established through the harvest fraction of the fishable biomass helped us derive the total allowable catch. And consistent with statewide allocations that are in the South Australia Management Plan for the South Australian Commercial Marine Scalefish Fishery, 81% of the snapper shares and total allowable catch for the southeast fishing zone were allocated to the commercial sector, 8% to the recreational sector, and 10% to the charter boat sector. There was also a nominal 1% for the Aboriginal traditional fishing sector to acknowledge their primary rights to the resource. And finally, an average southeast fish size of 1.98 kilos allowed management to convert the recreational weight share of the total allowable catch into individual animals. And this provided a necessary mechanism for us to be able to monitor catch levels. So, based on consultation and feedback from the then Recreational Advisory Group, and following advice from the Snapper Management Advisory Committee, the commencement of the first Southeast Fishing Zone calendar season of 2020 saw the implementation of a harvest tag trial for the recreational fishing sector. So to implement the arrangements quickly, harvest tags were bundled into packs of 5. A cost-free random ballot was run to assign the tag packs, and out of that we had over 3,000 applications for 606 available packs of tags. For compliance requirements, mandatory report forms were issued with the packs of tags, and the outcome of the 2020 Southeast Snapper season saw only 15% of the harvest tags utilised. So following this, based on further consultation and feedback consistent with the previous season, with the then Recreational Advisory Committee concerned with the underutilisation and the latent effort of the harvest tag trial was abandoned. Following further advice from the Snapper Management Advisory Committee, the commencement of the Southeast Fishing Zone's calendar season of 2021, we moved towards mandatory reporting. Now, under the mandatory reporting was implemented predominantly through the South Australian Fishing App, which was called the SA Fishing Guide at the time. Size bag and boat limits were set for mandatory reporting, so we had a size limit of 38 centimetres, a daily bag limit of 2 and a daily boat limit of 6. And so what we saw coming from the season of 2021, the fishery would be closed, of course, if the recreational share of the total allowable catch was caught. So 2021 concluded on March the 11th when the recreational share of the total allowable catch was reached. Now, due to the early closure of the 2021 fishery, we readjusted the Southeast Fishing Zone snapper season following the marine scalefish fishery reform, and so this took us into the financial years instead, reporting financial years. The total allowable catch continued, and the recreational share of the total allowable catch continued into the 21-22 season. However, we adjusted the fishing limits. So the fishing limits were adjusted to a daily bag of 1 and a daily boat limit of 3. And all of the other requirements remain the mandatory reporting through the South Australian Fishing app, and of course the fishery would be closed if the share of the recreational share of the TAC was reached. The conclusion of the 21 and 22 season saw a recreational catch of 65% of their share. So, after 3 complete seasons of adaptive management arrangements for a temporarily closed fishery, what did we learn? We learned that there were several risks, constraints and vulnerabilities of different styles of fisheries management tools. The need to evaluate and to learn from each of these trials is valuable for the future management of the South Australian recreational fisheries. So the decision process behind the removal of the harvest tag trial was based on a lack of utilisation. With the cost-free nature of the tag ballot, the inherent risk of people applying for a pack of tags with A, optimistic motives with little intention to use the tags, or B, ulterior motives with no intention of utilising the tags, came to light. The shift to mandatory reporting also produced its challenges. There were issues with some fishers that were unable to access smart technology and therefore use the app, so we provided a phone line as a backup, as a reporting mechanism. We found that there was intended under-reporting, and there were several reasons for it, but the most consistent reasons that came up were that fishers were not wanting to report in case the fishery was closed again. Fishers didn't want to give away their spots, they were concerned. And actually one of the most common were fishers that were saying that they were just unaware of the mandatory reporting requirements in total. So, now I want to shift back to the Snapper Management Advisory Committee. So you will have noticed we went through a whole range of fisheries management tools and adaptive arrangements. So what we discovered is the Snapper Management Advisory Committee model of representation, consultation and engagement with the correct stakeholders and knowledge bearers has proven to be valuable through the temporary snapper fishery closure. However, in moving forward, it's acknowledged that there are still vulnerabilities in a management advisory committee model. We find that some representative members have a tendency to advise in an organisational or advocacy role rather than as a recreational fisher or local user of the resource. And as you can imagine, this poses a risk to the recreational fishing community as it can fail to capture all of the views of the recreational fishing community in all of its diversity. So that risk can only be mitigated through regular inclusive consultation with the wider community and the increased ability for a broad range of stakeholders' feedback to be fed directly into the decision-making process. In carrying on a consultation model such as a management advisory committee, it's imperative that the membership that the committee is comprised of are liaising and consulting in a meaningful way with the interest holders, primary rights holders, to be able to negotiate stakeholders' needs and expectations better. So now I wish I had a bit of a good news story to finish off on, but unfortunately the most recent snapper stock assessment was released in November 2022. And although the stock assessment indicates a arrest in the decline of the Spencer Gulf West Coast and the Gulf St Vincent stocks, both of the stocks are still recovering and remain classified as depleted. So therefore the closure of the 2 fishing zones has been extended to June the 30th, 2026. Following the conclusion of the marine scalefish fishery reform, the Snapper Management Advisory Snapper Management Advisory Committee transitioned to the Marine Scalefish Fishery Management Advisory Committee, from which I'll refer to as the MSF MAC from here. And the MSF MAC was established, much like the Snapper MAC, to provide advice to guide the management of South Australia's largest and most diverse shared access fishery, not dissimilar to the one that Shane just described in his chat. So the management of the Marine MSF MAC was identical to that of the Snapper MAC in that it had an independent chair and all sector stakeholders involved, but we had the addition of a conservation sector member to the MSF MAC. So with over 60 target species, the MSF MAC has a much larger model of consultation and responsibility in delivering fair, appropriate, sustainable management arrangements for a diverse and complex fishery. And it looks like I finished up early, Cassie, so thank you very much. So thank you all for joining me.
Time to perfection. Some fantastic lessons there from WA and South Australia. I'd now like to welcome Kenny Bedford to the stand. Torres Strait traditional owner, fisher and leader. Looking forward to hearing from you. Now, let me move this on. We are getting better at this, everybody. Here you are. That will move your slides on for you, and then that's a little pointer if you need. Right. Yell out if you need me.
Okay, go on then. Go. Yeah. No. Thanks for those of you who are staying. Yeah, my name's Kenny Bedford. I'm a traditional owner from Erub in the north east of the Torres Strait. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri peoples and their ongoing connection to the land and seas of Naarm. I also want to acknowledge my countrymen here. Today we've got some traditional owner leaders from the Torres Strait. Those good-looking blokes there that you can talk to after if you've got any more questions. And I also want to acknowledge Natasha Stacey, Professor Natasha Stacey, who is from Charles Darwin University and is the co-PI, principal investigator for this project, along with our team members Tim Skuse and David Brewer. We are very blessed people, traditional owners in the Torres Strait, for our beautiful, pristine environment and also the very much sought after resources that come from our seas and also the livelihood that fisheries provides for us. And through a very unique management arrangement in the Torres Strait and very challenging situation, Torres Strait Islanders have been able to, over time, increase our control, ownership and involvement in the management of the Torres Strait fisheries. So in the Torres Strait we've got our most lucrative fishery, the Torres Strait tropical rock lobster fishery. We've got a prawn fishery that we don't participate in, Spanish mackerel, coral trout. We have 100% ownership and management over that. We do lease some of that out, which is going to be important. You'll see in this presentation. And also we have a beach to move fishery and traditional fisheries such as turtle and dugong that we also manage. And that's, again, a very challenging situation where we've got Commonwealth, state, we share a border with Papua New Guinea, so we have catch sharing arrangements with Papua New Guinea, and we have non-Indigenous, Indigenous rights, sea claims, and a whole complexity of things that impact on our management arrangements. But through this participation, at every level of the decision-making process, right through to the PZJA, and I acknowledge Wes, who's here from AFMA, FRDC, who also fund this, and the TSRA, reflecting really the importance of this study and this project in our region. But what was I saying here? Over time, it's interesting because when we first got into fisheries management, or we sat at the table, there was a real reluctance around our participation and in our trust of data collection, giving our information over. But over time, we learnt as fisheries managers the importance of this for good governance and management of the resources that we've got. So very important objectives under the legislation are, one, sustainability is at the key objective, as well as the livelihood of our peoples. So we've come over time to do very well at monitoring our commercial catches. We're doing very bad at monitoring our traditional catches, apart from turtle and dugong, which was a huge step again in putting us in this position now where we've discovered through a previous subject that we did. I don't know where that went. Oh, sorry, I haven't used it. Through a previous project we did, we discovered that although there was, or there is, a the community wants this to happen. They want to put in place catch monitoring data for non-commercial species, because we understand now as custodians of those traditional species, we've got a responsibility and we've got to be accountable to the next generation. So ironically, through the commercial management lessons, we're now going to start applying this, or we're looking at the value of doing this for our own traditional fisheries, because we're introducing new methods. You know, we've got speedboats, we've got these other technologies and things that are making it much, fishing much more accessible to people. But then we've also got this other important external force, which is fisheries or fish or resources going away from community. So not only from community to community, but lots of white foam eskies going south to families, and we don't have any idea about that. So it's becoming more and more important to our communities that we better understand where our subsistence or how we manage our subsistence and traditional fishery, which is very different to the recreational fisheries that we're talking about here. But what we're interested in is how recreational fishers have been able to do this, because you've got apps and technology that you're applying at the moment that we're not using, but I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit. So this investigation now is going to take us to the communities around the Torres Strait to talk to them about designing something now that's going to work for us, and more importantly, something that people are going to pick up and use. So we're going to go to 18 communities across the Torres Strait in coming months to talk to them about what's going to be in that app that what do we need to consider to put into this app design so that people are going to use it. What we've learnt from the last project was that people don't want to do paper-based things. They don't want to. They won't respond to the rangers collecting information. And what we've learnt is that we need to give, if anything, ownership and incentives that are beyond just collecting the fish data. So we want to create and design something that complements existing data systems through the ranger program. We've got an excellent ranger program. So how does this fit into what the rangers are doing? How does it serve what it's been funded here for? Fisheries information. So where can we turn on and off a tap that empowers communities to not only collect data but be managers of that information to various stakeholders, but most importantly to ourselves as managers in our communities of the resources we've got, because we're running blind at the moment, and unless we have a much better understanding, and this is by community, it's different. The environment's different, there are cultural differences, so that's why we have to go to all of them. And we think, through the devices, telephones and those sort of things, we can try and design something that's going to be not only easy to put data into, so we're talking about women and families who go fishing off the beach, to people who are out coming back with commercial catches but taking home food as well. All of those different scenarios, how do we make it easy so that they can take a photo, and we know there's some technology around, the fish are automatically identified, counted, put it in somewhere in a database that then gets sorted. But one of the other key things we've picked up is people are obviously worried about IP and where things go, but that's what we're going to have to work through. And the other really important point, really I think for today and for others who are interested in this, is how it's part of a much broader resource management tool, so that there's a cultural element and this importance that's part of it, where you have a better understanding of your environment. We've got our cultural knowledges put into that, so you don't have to rely on grandfather or grandmother to pass that on. An app will help play that cultural transfer role in all of the resources in our communities. And we hope that that has some transferability as well to other communities. And if any of you have any ideas, because we're not really technical people, but we've sort of put the feelers out there to app builders, I don't know what you call them, technology people, to say we're doing this and we're welcoming you to come now, because we feel like the earlier we can get people involved in this research and understanding what it is we actually need, the better when it comes to designing this tool. And again, it's for not just Torres Strait, but has really important applications across Australia and the world. I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Excellent, some fantastic insights there. So that's the last of our speakers. I'll ask all of our 4 speakers just to take your place in the panel. We've had some fantastic insights into resource sharing and fisheries management culturally and in South Australia and Western Australia. So let's capitalise on those brains we have in the room, and if there's any questions, they must be into the microphone, please. We've got the microphone at the back roving. That's so our friends online can watch us and can hear all of your questions, so that's very important. So, questions? One down the front.
Just a question for Ken. What's your internet access like in the Straits and access to devices?
Yeah, good question. It's patchy, but getting much better. The TSRA members may be able to tell us, because that's one of the things on the top of the agenda. But most places have some access, so yeah, I was thinking about my Facebook page, and yeah, everybody's on that. No, it's pretty much widespread now, and 5G almost we've got there, so and that's become important for safety as well.
Any more? Up the back?
Sorry, another one for you, Kenny. So I'm just flagging, I've been working in the Pacific for the last couple of years, and there are some apps out there that might be, we've been using them in PNG, so it's pretty applicable for community-based stuff. Essentially, from the photo, species ID, length estimate, and then it goes through a rapid stock assessment process, so you end up with a number that the communities can compare and contrast with other areas. So, yeah.
Correct.
Thanks very much. I'm actually going to be cheeky and ask 2 questions, if that's all right. One of Shane and Skye. Similar stories, obviously, of fish stocks depleted through overfishing, drastic action taken, very slow recovery, if at all, which we're seeing in Commonwealth fisheries as well. Any work being undertaken to try and untangle signals of climate change as part of the impact originally, or the slow recovery on that? And if I may, Kenny, fantastic presentation. I was just wondering, and I should probably know this, does the project contemplate also including PNG treaty villages and the traditional catch that they take on both sides of the line?
Not quite, not yet, but it's a really good point to make, and I think it's probably part of that comment I made that. Oh yeah, part of that comment I made that if we can get it right here, we can transfer it, but through the bilateral arrangements we've got and the working groups where PNG are involved in some of those, we'd be sharing this obviously, and very much wanting to encourage similar use, because we share the cost, the stock. They don't see the border there, and where we can help our traditional brothers and sisters across the border, that'd be great.
Wes, is it? Nice to meet you. As far as your question concerning the marine South Australian marine commercial marine scalefish fishery, we're not specifically looking into any climate change impacts on those. I guess a lot of our research has been focused on the intricacies of the fact that we've got those 3 snapper stocks with little to no mixing, and we're seeing a lot of variability between the recruitment periods for all 3 stocks at different times of the year. However, as far as our shared access fishery for blue crabs, we are starting to have the conversations to discuss the potential and anecdotal range shifting that's heading southwards with our crabs. So that is very much in the part of the recreational space.
Thanks for the question, Wes. So climate change is one of the key, I suppose, knowledge gaps identified through the consultation process, and part of the $10 million support package is to do some science on climate change impacts. We had a workshop with CSIRO last week with the handbook that I think AFMA has also been using West Coast as a case study for the first fishery in Western Australia. So that's really about identifying our knowledge gaps and also looking at some of the potential proactive management responses we can do looking into the future. But there's definitely more broader across West Coast or across the Western Australia. We're seeing definitely challenges in the management of our fisheries more broader, and it's going to be something that's going to be continuing raising red flags, no doubt, in the short and medium term.
Question here at the front, Michael.
Yeah, Mike Gilby, Victoria Fisheries. My question's probably to the whole panel, but I'll direct the first one to Skye. I'm interested, Skye, to the 1% allocation to traditional fishers in South Australia and how the closure of the fisheries impacts on that 1% and the mobility of fishers across South Australia.
Okay, so there's a few parts to that question, Mike. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
No, that's totally fine. So I probably should have been much clearer during my chat to infer towards the nominal nature of the 1%. It really, I mean, as First Nations and land holders, you having the primary rights and access under native title always continues, even throughout the fishery. So that 1% nominal was to ensure that the primary rights of the local native title holders is acknowledged and continue to be acknowledged in our formal documents such as management plans and under the Fisheries Management Act. So is that...
Yeah.
Yeah?
The mobility of... Are we seeing mobilisation of our fishers across those three areas? Like
just in general?
In general, because I know mobs just don't concentrate in one area, their energy in one area, there is mobilisation. And I think your presentation sort of picked that up, the mobilisation of fishers across.
Yeah. Look, we haven't received any data on that specifically, Mike, but again, under our instruments in South Australia as well, we have allowances acknowledging that, you know, when you're talking about your mobs, they're not just a mob that's here and another mob that's over here. You're all entwined, you're all related, and you're all involved across those regions. So we ensure that there's some flexibility in the model to make sure that those that do move and mobilise and do still have the primary rights as native title holders to fish have those rights.
Yeah.
We've probably got time for two more questions. Up the back.
My question is to Claire. I'm Adoshi from Natural Capital Economics. Apologies, everyone. This is a question for the data nerds in the room. Really amazing data set that you have, but you talked briefly towards the end about some sort of social and economic indicators used in the decision making. I'm just interested to hear what sort of indicators you're thinking of and how do you envisage that fitting into some sort of measurement of, you know, effectiveness or efficacy of management?
So I think it's really early days in looking into this sort of application of these other social and economic indicators. In our surveys, every survey we've asked a series of sort of economic questions, and so some of that data on the economics is available, also around satisfaction with the fishery and with the management, and we're looking at building in more of those questions into future surveys and more standard reporting. So I think, that will come over time with all that data. Sorry, I can't remember the second part of the question.
Sort of how do you envisage that fitting into measuring efficacy of management?
Yeah, and I think, I guess looking at long-term trends and how they change over time for specific small-scale or the larger fisheries like the West Coast demersal, so it's the first step. And definitely that improving the evaluation and management settings is something we definitely need to keep considering. And
Very good. Got time for one more? Another one up the back.
Probably one for Skye and Shane. Sorry, guys. I'm just interested in seeing the decline in the stock and the strong management approaches that you've been putting in place. It follows a little bit on from Wes's question, I guess, is that are you having a conversation around shifting your baseline limit and your targets to account for potential regime and productivity shifts in the fishery? And what does that look like, and how do you have that conversation with your stakeholders around changing the baseline to what you're managing towards?
Great question. I think getting an understanding of some of the climate impacts more broadly across the stakeholder groups is important as a starting point. I mentioned that some of those species like WA jewfish and bulging groper are really iconic and highly valued by recreational fishers, and so it's really difficult to have that discussion around changing baselines or even species composition and those sort of things. From my mind, it's probably, in the West Coast example, it's probably shifting distributions of species. So there may be actually other species coming in and replacing those from further north. But that's something, it's starting to be noticed, but we're probably too early days at this stage. But the discussion now is around trying to have some of those more precautionary management approaches through the harvest strategy, which was already put in place. They were a lot more precautionary in terms of where they put their limit reference points, for example, trying to account for some of those changes.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Look, I really wish I had an answer for this for you, but unfortunately we're still quite in the infancy of setting new targets ourselves in South Australia. I mentioned in my chat that we've just concluded a fisheries reform across the marine scalefish fishery. So the entire fishery, not just specific to snapper, but the 60 plus species that are targeted within that fishery we're now moving towards revising harvest strategies with, of course, new measures and new goals to be incorporated into that, and the overarching management plan as well. So it's very, very early on. I think it probably commenced whilst I've been here, the review. But to add things that we're here talking about, consultation and stakeholders' needs as well. Part of the process is, again, another committee will be established that it will be similar to the MSF MAC in undertaking this review. So they will be bringing persons with the expertise and, again, who are cognisant of all of the interest groups and primary rights holders in that fishery to join us and guide that review in the harvest strategy and management plan.
Very good. Well, that's about all we have time for, because it's afternoon tea time. Please thank our fantastic 4 fisheries managers.